You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, nonpartisan look at a range of timely topics that matter most to business leaders. To help make sense of these topics and how they'll unfold, we'll sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best at the Conference Board, provide trusted insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this podcast series. And in today's conversation, we're going to discuss why China-U.S. relations have been on a downward trend over the past few years and examine China's relations with other Western nations. Joining me today is Sam Charlton, the Managing Director of Asia at the Conference Board. Sam, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Okay, so Sam, you've been over in Asia and Japan and now Singapore for most of your career. Just tell us a little bit about your experience in Asia.
Yeah, so I ended up in Asia somewhat serendipitously, I suppose. After I graduated from high school, I basically applied to an organization called GAP in the UK and said, send me anywhere in the world outside of Europe. And I ended up in China. And this would be the sort of mid-90s. And I fell in love with the country. And I've been a Sinophile ever since. Ended up majoring in Chinese. And then somewhat... Serendipitously, I suppose. Yes, maybe that's the word. And ended up going on a working holiday to Japan, which was supposed to be a sort of short break before I ended up spending 23 of the last 23 years there, basically. So,
and you're fluent, and you're fluent in multiple languages.
My Japanese is pretty good. My Chinese is very, very ropey after so long out of the country. I'm quite happy to be in Singapore now, which is Chinese speaking, so I get more of a chance to use my Chinese a bit more.
Yeah, and you were with The Economist for a long time.
That's right, the last 12 years.
Yeah.
So I was running one of their divisions in Asia.
Yeah. So lots and lots of experience, and interfacing with all the organizations around the world, the multinationals who are trying to do business in Asia. So exactly what we want to talk about today. So let's start with the big elephant in the room, which is the U.S.-China relations. It felt like for a long time things were between 1949 and about a decade ago, it was just on this great build. Trade was improving, relations were improving. A lot of manufacturing was moved over there. That seemed like there was going to be this great partnership. And now, over the past decade, it's cooled, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, initially, the U.S. policy of engagement with China, so from Nixon's time, that was driven by sort of realpolitik, right? The idea that China would be a counterweight to the Soviet Union. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think there was this feeling that China would develop economically, and that would lead to political liberalization as well. I think what's happened, though, of course, is that it hasn't liberalized politically, and it's become a much bigger economy, much more quickly, and a much more powerful country militarily during that period. And I think that obviously raised some alarm in the U.S. and then we've seen the sort of policy response to that from starting with the Trump administration, right? Efforts to sort of contain China to some degree.
Yeah, well, the kids have, this saying that people are frenemies,
right.
Which is kind of, I don't know if that's apropos to this, but they are not allies, the United States and China, but they have been business partners for a long time, and now they're looking at, kind of being competitive with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the relationship for a long time was mutually beneficial. Fed economic growth in the U.S. as well as in China. But I think that the relationship sort of became a little bit more one-sided, and maybe a lot more of the benefit was accruing to China. And then as China became more of a sort of strategic rival to the U.S., especially in the Indo-Pacific region, again, I think that sort of set some alarm bells ringing. But it's not all about U.S. policy here as well, of course, right? China's become much more bellicose in its international relations, and I think that's been driving a lot of fear about where this is leading.
And it's not just China versus the U.S. It's China really juxtaposed to the West in general. Talk about
and that's more of a new thing, right? If you go back even just a few years, we were talking about an investment partnership between the EU and China, and that was quite in sort of contrast to what the US was doing with China at the time. So Europe wasn't really very aligned behind US efforts to contain China. And it's really some of the things we've seen in Xinjiang, for example, the human rights abuses in Xinjiang, and then, of course, the crackdown on the protest movement in Hong Kong, and then the sanctioning of EU entities and politicians that really I see as a sort of watershed moment in sort of turning public opinion and in, of course, opinion in the political classes in Europe against China. And you see now much more alignment of other Western countries behind the U.S. position.
Yeah, but the West is obviously all kind of in the same boat together on this because they've moved their supply chains to China, to take advantage of labor arbitrage. It's so cheap to do it there that you can make the stuff in China and you can then spend oodles of money shipping it around the world and still end up better off, right? But that's evaporating.
Yeah, and that's not just about the geopolitical situation. That's also about the danger of having your supply chains concentrated in one place. It's about rising costs of manufacturing in China. It's about rising shipping costs as well. There are a few things that are driving MNCs to look at sort of diversifying their supply chains outside of China. But yes, the geopolitical angle is certainly one factor.
So is it inevitable that China is going to be the dominant economy and culture in the world?
No, I don't think so. And I think some of the U.S. policy decisions we've seen recently, especially the export controls rather on semiconductor design software, manufacturing equipment, and the like, that will definitely slow China's race towards tech parity with the U.S. So no, I don't think it's inevitable. And growth in China is slowing, right? I think we were expecting perhaps China to surpass the U.S. by around 2030 in terms of nominal GDP. Seems like it'll take quite a lot longer now.
Yeah, and the U.S. of course has a fraction of the population, so GDP per capita, long way to go there. But so Sam, the other players that have kind of thrown in here with China are India and Russia. Talk about that relationship, because it seems a bit of a shotgun marriage. They've been squabbling over a few borders in there up until recently.
Yeah, I'm sort of slightly skeptical there is a sort of China, Russia, India axis. I think that, if you look at India's relationship with Russia, for example, that is quite strategic. It's one of the biggest arms suppliers. Russia is one of the biggest arms suppliers for India.
For China and India, yeah, but also oil.
Yeah, I think that's more opportunistic, though. It's India sees a sort of opportunity to get cheap oil from Russia in a pinch. I don't think that's necessarily a sort of strategic play. It's just makes good commercial sense for them.
Yeah, so if they, essentially, if Russia, tamps down the pipeline that goes west, it has to go somewhere else, so it flows south and east.
Indeed.
Yeah, and that's so. Is that a, they're not, it's sort of strange bedfellows because they're different cultures. They don't really like each other. The three groups. But so is it a forced thing that is temporary, or is it a marriage of convenience that could last?
Yeah, I think if you think about Sino-Russian relations, I think it's they are sort of somewhat sort of geostrategic rivals. If you look at Central Asia, right, the traditional sphere of influence of Russia, but we see the sort of Belt and Road Initiative, China making sort of commercial and infrastructure inroads into that area. So there's definitely some sort of competition there, and there's definitely no military alliance between the two, right? It's hard to imagine China going to war in Europe to support the Russian invasion of Ukraine, for example, or indeed, Russia supporting militarily supporting an invasion of Taiwan or anything like that. It seems more like a sort of a political support relationship.
Well, and a political support relationship that is important because if they both support each other's political ambitions and make up the trade imbalances from sanctions that are put on from other nations, then it is a symbiotic
Sure.
relationship.
Sure. Yeah.
Hong Kong, of course, was a British colony up until almost recently. Some still think it is, and of course they play polo and have fun. And they still drive on the wrong side of the road, I'll have to point out.
Singapore too.
And so these former colonies. But is it done? I mean, is there any relationship anymore between Hong Kong and the UK, or is it all just historical now?
So I think between the peoples of the two territories, let's call them, certainly still ongoing relationships, and a lot of immigration from Hong Kong to the UK. And also, in fact, to other places in Asia, like Singapore as well. So I think there's still ongoing sort of people-to-people relationships, but on a sort of bilateral sort of country-to-territory relationship. I think that's a thing of the past, I suppose.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. Now, the ASEAN region, that trading pact, which is the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore, is something that kind of came together, 30, 40 years ago. It's been a long time coming. It's been, over the years, they've taken down trade barriers. And that was viewed as, a group of nations that was really going to get together, not only economically, but perhaps even closer. How do you read that relationship today?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because there's it's very, very different to the EU, where there's much more sort of parity, I think, in terms of the size of the economies and the level of development of the economies, right? In ASEAN, you have extremely developed countries like Singapore with one of the highest GDPs per capita in the world, and you have vast countries like Indonesia, which are still relatively poor and undeveloped. So I think trade and economic relationships will continue to prosper, but it's hard to imagine sort of political union developing like we're seeing in the EU.
But as China now begins to distance itself from the West, and American and European companies, multinationals, are seeking alternate places for their supply chains and regional headquarters, those kinds of things, places to do business. Does the ASEAN region once again become more attractive?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, it's a huge population group, over 600 million people. So as a bloc, it's big by itself. It's growing quickly. In some cases, faster than China these days. Yeah, I think it's a tremendous opportunity. And you are seeing firms start to relocate some of their headquarters, especially out of Hong Kong, less so from the mainland. But it's definitely going to be an important investment destination for multinational companies.
Well, and there's the rule of law.
Yes.
Which is very helpful
yes.
When you're trying to conduct business.
Always one of the advantages of Hong Kong, right? But that's now been, I think, substantially eroded.
We've explored China's relationship with the U.S. and the West. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about the geopolitical tensions, especially with China and Taiwan, and what that means for multinationals. We'll take a short break, and we'll be right back.
As you and your company monitor the latest wave of shocks that have battered the U.S. economy, the award-winning forecast team at the Conference Board now predicts a recession by the end of 2022. This recession will further compound the crises that have recently upended original expectations, from a deadly pandemic to a war in Ukraine and the highest inflation in decades. Yet, unprecedented crises also present unforeseen opportunities if you have a trusted, proven navigator by your side. With that in mind, and as the Conference Board has always done, we are providing you with daily, timely, and relevant content that will guide the business community through the economic storm. These trusted insights are being gathered on our website and are available to help your company master the challenges ahead. Visit us at conference-board.org/topics/recession. Then, on November 29th, join us for a live virtual briefing from our economists and other financial experts. It's complimentary to you and your colleagues. Register now on our website to hear the latest on weathering this economic turbulence.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Sam Charlton, the Managing Director of Asia for the Conference Board. Okay, so Sam, we've talked a little bit about the relationship of Western nations with China, a little bit about the ASEAN region, but there is this little skirmish going on. in the world, I guess politically at least, over this whole notion of the China-Taiwan reunion. Now, tell us what you can about the history of the island with the mainland.
Yes. China never really controlled Taiwan at any point in its history, right? It was a sort of a Qing dynasty outpost at one point, and then of course it was a Japanese colony for quite a long time, and then of course after the nationalists lost the Civil War, that's really when 1949, right, exactly, and the Kuomintang fled to Taiwan. That's really the first time you get sort of substantial Chinese, if you want to call it Chinese, rule over Taiwan.
Right, and it was a European colony at one point. The island of Formosa, as they used to call it as well. So it's been around the horn a few times, but it's only in the last, as you say, what is that, 50, 70 years that it's really had this link. But the link is not to the Chinese mainland per se, but it's the Chiang Kai-shek. It's the dissident group, the nationalists that left China, and essentially Mao and the Communist Revolution took the mainland. So, but they don't like that, do they?
They do not. They do not.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about what's been happening in the South China Sea and these, the Spratlys and these bases that are coming on, building up militarily.
Yeah.
They're claiming the South China Sea as their territory all the way up to almost the border of Taiwan.
Yes, exactly. So the 9-dash line, which designates China's claim over essentially the entirety of the South China Sea, and puts it in opposition with countries like the Philippines and Vietnam, who have competing claims, and they've been sort of reclaiming basically shoals and building, reclaiming land and then building military bases on these shoals to sort of project power out into the South China Sea and sort of challenge, U.S. access to the South China Sea and U.S. ability to sort of project power into that region.
Yeah, and they're establishing sovereignty all the way out to Taiwan and some of these islands that are really claimed by these other countries. So they're not being very good neighbors here.
They are not, and it's creating quite a lot of friction with these other nations in the region. And it's a difficult line for these other countries to tread, because in many cases China's their biggest trade and investment partner, and yet they are also U.S. allies and have their own territorial disputes with China. So, in many ways, China's assertiveness, or to put another way, bellicosity around some of these claims, it has caused a deterioration in relations with these countries.
Yeah, and we've done other podcasts on the China-Taiwan situation, and nobody really knows what's going to happen here, but it does seem that they are destined for conflict at some point. What should multinational companies be thinking of?
Well, first of all, let me just deal with the question: do we think there will be conflict? I think quite unlikely in the short to mid-term. I don't think we'll see a shooting war in the Taiwan Straits. It's one of those sort of gray swans, right? It's absolutely possible, and firms should definitely prepare for it. But I think it's unlikely, and I think the Russian debacle in Ukraine makes it less likely, because it's sort of shown that it's not a sure thing, right? If they did intervene militarily, it would be risky. There's no guarantee that they would prevail. And also, I think the unified sanctions response from the West was a bit of a surprise, and obviously would hit China far, far harder than it's hit Russia. Russia was somewhat sort of economically isolated from the rest of the world, was able to sort of weather the storm. But China's very, very interconnected, both in trade and financial terms, with the rest of the world. So, yeah, I think it would be a huge risk for the CCP to initiate a war, and I just don't think they have the risk appetite to do that.
But if you're going to, if you're a large multinational company, particularly one that uses any form of semiconductor,
yes,
which is almost all of them,
yeah,
you should probably be hedging that risk.
Oh, for sure. Like I said, it's a gray swan, so it's something that you absolutely need to prepare for. I don't think it's hugely likely in the short to midterm, as I said. But
so therefore,
absolutely.
there's time. I mean, you couldn't conceive of a worse risk case because you've got 90% of the world's supply of advanced semiconductors being produced on that island. So,
yeah.
Is there now a race by all these firms to get that manufacturing out of there and disperse it?
Yeah, I mean, just news today, I think that SK Hynix are evaluating whether they continue to produce semiconductors in China. That's actually more to do with the export controls, but
right. But the Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company also has opened up 3 facilities on the mainland. So, regardless of what happens, you still have too much concentrated there. Okay, so now let's just assume that the relationships, the geopolitical tensions continue with China and the West. How actively should companies be moving their manufacturing out of China?
I think they should be actively looking at alternative manufacturing sites, so to diversify perhaps their manufacturing base where possible. And also the same for supply chains, really, right? Having your supply chains concentrated in China, which many firms did for many years, I think is extremely risky right now. So firms should absolutely be looking at that.
And it was a deliberate and brilliant strategy on the part of China, and they're very long-term strategists in this, but it's been over 20, 30 years that people have been investing and putting the capital structure in place in China, and of course the semiconductor business in Taiwan. So it won't take 20, 30 years to get it out, but it will take more than 20, 30 months. So it's the kind of thing where manufacturing companies need to start moving.
Yeah, absolutely, and I mean that's part of the objective of the CHIPS Act. We saw CHIPS and Science Act. We saw recently from the Biden administration is basically subsidies and support for reshoring semiconductor manufacturing to the U.S. or to other or friendshoring in some cases, perhaps in countries which are more sort of friendly to Western values.
Well, where are the safe havens that people are seeking for manufacturing?
For manufacturing, I think U.S. and Europe.
But that's just very expensive because so it's highly automated to move it and then automate it.
Yeah, I mean it is expensive, but I guess the risk is high enough that it makes sense still. And we're so dependent on these advanced semiconductors that the cost of, all of these geopolitical tensions are going to increase the cost of doing business. I think that's just an inevitability, right? The bifurcation.
And the cost is going to have to be passed on to the consumer, which means inflation. And so, that does build the case for slower growth and, stickiness of inflation for years.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Yeah. There's another big couple of players in the region, and we haven't talked about it. That's Australia and New Zealand. Australia is its own continent, even, and but we never think about that when we talk about Asia. Big opportunity or not?
In what sense?
Well, for multinationals to diversify and maybe enhance trade, move manufacturing, supply chains. The problem is it's further away, and it's a small population, and it's not cheap there either, is it?
No, indeed.
Yeah. So I think people are looking more at Vietnam and some of the other Southeast Asian nations for potential manufacturing sites. But
Thailand, for example, already a big part of the automotive supply chain. So perhaps countries like that.
Yeah. But it over time, it has to. You've got to reshore, get things closer, I would think. We did a podcast that our listeners can look up on the potential of NAFTA or now the USMCA PAC as a potential reshoring opportunity, and to think about that more broadly, which hasn't been discussed, which is just a mind-boggler. Any other thoughts on the geopolitical tensions and what multinationals should be thinking about in the region?
Yeah, so I think there's a few thoughts about how businesses should sort of adapt in order to cope with these geopolitical tensions. I think the China for China strategy, where your manufacturing in China is focused on the China market. That's certainly something a lot of firms are looking at, and it probably makes a lot of sense. Again, making sure your supply chains aren't highly concentrated anywhere, in fact. It doesn't have to just be about China, although a lot of these supply chains do, of course, run through China. So, you hear a lot of China plus one. I think probably even more diversified than that makes sense, although, of course, there are cost implications for that. Reshoring or friend-shoring productions, I think that is something that a lot of firms will be looking at, especially given the high cost of fuel and transportation at the moment, shipping. Planning ahead for grey swans. I mean, we sort of talked about this a little bit earlier in relation to Taiwan. Again, I think it's pretty unlikely that we see a shooting war in the short term, but it's not impossible. And so firms should definitely have contingency plans, business continuity plans in place for that. Do some scenario analysis to make sure they're prepared for that event. I think if they're operating in China, they have to be a bit more aware of potential reputational risks of operating in China. And that sort of works both ways. Their perception in Western markets for being in China, and also, of course, getting caught on the wrong side of the Chinese populace's view of, US or Western firms and countries.
Well, this has just shown itself recently with Russia, where all these Western companies have been forced because of public opinion to pull out. And, that's okay because it's a relatively small country, in terms of population, 150 million people or so, whereas China's 10 times that.
Yeah, I mean, that would be a much, much more painful for Western firms, no doubt. Yeah. And then if you're operating in China, I mean, investing more in government relations, I think that's important, having a strong government relations team in your China entity to help shield you a little bit from the sort of vicissitudes of geopolitical tensions.
Yeah. Well, those are great words of wisdom. Sam Charlton, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
And thanks to all of you for listening in to CEO Perspectives. Every week, I'll be joined by a prominent thought leader to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover the leading topics in geopolitics, economics, public policy, ESG, and more. Please share CEO Perspectives with your colleagues, with your neighbors, with your friends, with other countries. I know they're going to want to listen. I'm Steve Odland, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.